Well, hello everyone. My name is Ray Chang and I'm with the Asian American Christian Collaborative. I'm really excited to be here with Dr. Paul Lim, a friend of mine and a renowned scholar on Reformation studies, who works at Vanderbilt Divinity School. We're going to have a conversation on the Asian American Christian or Asian American Christian Collaborative statement on anti-Asian racism in the time of COVID-19, as well as the ways in which we can address issues of race from the discipline that Paul is an expert in. I'm so glad to be here with you, Paul.
Same here. Yeah, glad to be invited to do this with you today.
Yeah, I know it's exciting. As we begin, I'd be curious, why did you sign and support the statement? I mean, we were so grateful to see the support from many of the faculty members, including like Emily Pound at Vanderbilt Divinity School. As you read it, what drew you to it?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, as a fellow Asian American, I was born in South Korea, came here when I was in middle school at age 15, and been here ever since with a 4-year stint in England for my graduate studies. So I, until I was 15, race never was an issue, right? And so for first 15 years of my life, or first 12 years of my conscious existence, I never thought once about race as a term that category or analytic category or existential dilemma that applied to me in any way. But then I think ever since I came to America, I've been thinking about race every single day of my life. And when I say something like that, many of my colleagues, particularly white folks, they seem really surprised. And so, and for other reasons as well, I think it seems that when there's a discourse about race, it has become really bifurcated as white and black. When I talk to my white colleagues or black colleagues individually, they see that there is some better instantiation of racial diversity conversations that go beyond the dichotomy, black-white dichotomy. And I thought that this thing, with, coronavirus, there was a lot of a groundswell of people talking about the sort of overt or implicit or explicit racisms that were occurring against people of Asian descent. Just I think a week ago, Kyung La, who was a national correspondent for CNN, when she was doing a segment for CNN News in LA of all places, apparently someone walked up to her and just hurled some racial epithet. And she was so surprised. And I think she invited him, like, what did you say? And he said it again. And I think that was really, really a tragic and comic kind of a segment in our nation's history, I think. I think combination of all of those things, and having a niece who lives in Chicago, and she said to me that she felt a couple of instances either unsafe or something was said to her about her. And though nothing of that sort has happened to me personally, but doesn't mean that this is something that doesn't affect people. So as Dr. King said, injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. And I think with that logic in mind, I sent it to my colleagues at Vanderbilt University as well as the Divinity School. And so there are signatories, I think quite a number, both from the university, but primarily from the Divinity School. And I think I was appreciative of their kind of signing on to it right away. I even had a colleague who's not a Christian, a Jew, a sociologist, who said, I want to sign it as an expression of solidarity as well.
Yeah, no, we were so encouraged as we were watching all the signatures come in. Now we've gotten over 10,000 signatures, which in under a month is a remarkable thing, for an issue like this, and we're just so grateful for it. But you and I were having a conversation even before we were recording about some of the internal wrestlings that you had, and I'd be wondering if you'd be willing to share some of that.
I'll be very willing to share. I mean, so I think for me, my first language is Korean, or was Korean. Now is kind of simultaneously English and Korean. My wife came from Korea, and so our son looks like me. I mean, better than me, but looks like me. It's kind of typically and genetically. And so I think the whole almost but not quite kind of sensibility within was something that was brewing with inside of me. Ever since coming to America, I think I've done all my education and employment within what you will call white dominant institutions, right? So high school was in New Jersey, college was in New Haven, Connecticut, and seminary and PhD program, and first job at Gordon Conwell, now at Vanderbilt. These are what you would call, I don't know what the technical term is, but it's a white dominant institutions. And yet at the same time, I can honestly say that some of my closest friends and mentors have been either African Americans or Asian Americans. So when this news came, and I forwarded it to my colleagues at Vanderbilt Divinity School right away, I did not, and I did not send it to my colleagues at Christ Presbyterian Church. So it's a flagship PCA church in Nashville, led by a very faithful and kind of I don't want to use the word woke in a kind of cavalier way, but so we're trying to be more aware, kind of Pastor Scott Sauls. And so I did not send it to them. I think Scott, he might have gotten it from me individually, but not to the pastoral staff or the staff at church. And I, until you and I were talking, I never even thought at all about that. But it does become an issue for some kind of internal musing, if not kind of, it's not an existential kind of dilemma, but, why didn't I? I think perhaps in the sort of more progressive context, maybe my Asian identity is something that is, at least in theory, right, willing to be validated, negotiated, discussed, and kind of valorized, right? And stories of my experience taken seriously and whatnot. Whereas I think within the larger evangelical church, maybe this is emblematic of how we do diversity within evangelicalism. Diversity is something like this in some ways. We will have different colors and ethnicities represented but still diversity of ethnicities, but also kind of a uniformity when it comes to cultural expressions and the way we are and behave and interact with one another. And so it is perhaps an implicit downplaying of the ethnic specificities and the narratives that these ethnic specificities will bring with them. So, I mean, there was no like meta or secondary, tertiary level, analysis of why I wasn't sending it to my colleagues. It never even occurred to me. And so I think, what this conversation is affording me to do is to really kind of take as a quick deep dive into why I didn't do it. And I think perhaps in that more conservative context, it will require more explaining, like, I thought you were American, you're one of us. Why do we talk about differences so much? And I think that historically in American evangelicalism, white American evangelicalism, I think we have emphasized the oneness that Jesus can bring and the blood and the redeeming work of Jesus brings and the ongoing work of the Holy Spirit will bring us more united. And so that unity was often tragically translated into uniformity of expressions and experiences. Therefore, perhaps it did not leave room for or create space for a kind of dialogical engagement that comes from diverse perspectives. Maybe that was what I was implicitly and maybe erroneously, maybe justifiably afraid of, or maybe that the fact that I never even thought twice about emailing it to them is indicative of my own pathology. So I don't want to pass it on to them and says, it's your fault. And yet the fact that it never occurred to me to email it to them. So again, I don't want to be misquoted here. No one at Christ Press said, we don't think you're a Korean American or blah, blah, blah. I think in some ways, I think maybe they only looked at me as a Korean rather than an American. So I didn't want to further accentuate that notion that I'm a perpetual foreigner by talking about Asian American issue. I'd rather talk about college football or World Series or, you know what I'm saying, or LeBron James or something that most quote unquote Americans would be able to gravitate toward and rally around. But this particular issue of race that is non-Black, because I think, at our church at Christ Press, they are very well aware of the issues and the national legacies of Civil War and post-civil rights context of race relations. And I think in that regard, they're much more aware. But then I think the kind of model minority, like you really have done well, you can speak into the white context and We don't know much about where you came from, but you look differently from us, but you speak our language. So I think maybe there is that. And then I think maybe furthering that kind of a assumption or role play that I have, maybe that's why I didn't bring it up, because I didn't want to stir the pot. I don't know.
No, and I think that's the complexity of this is exactly where we sit as Asian Americans, right?
Yes.
We're not really allowed the space to navigate and to process through all these things because there are so many different layers and so many different levels and so many different ways of looking at it. I mean, I was grateful for Pastor Scott's endorsement of the statement. I had no idea
Yes.
I actually even went to his church. And he's one of the most creative pastors that I think are out there right now in terms of his engagement with different issues, and so like I've been following him and seeing the ways in which he engages with pluralism and religious diversity, as well as in terms of other aspects that have to do with justice overall. And his voice has been something that one of the voices that I've appreciated. But I do think that there's something about the internal negotiation that you faced that can't be separated from your own past experiences, as well as your understanding of the perspectives and views that some people in different contexts might have, as well as kind of the ways in which you have learned how to negotiate in a largely white dominant society, that that if you bring more of yourself into any specific context, that there is there are more things that people can either misconstrue or basically attribute negatively to you. And so you were talking about the perpetual foreignerness. Like no one wants to feel like a foreigner, especially like for me, I grew up here in the United States all of my life. I was born and raised in the United States, and so my Korean American expression is just as American as I see it as any other American, whether they're white, black, Latino. But growing up all my life, I knew that in the society's mind, which is oftentimes the same racialized mind as the church at large, especially the evangelical church, my Korean American identity or my Korean American expression was always second class, or it felt like it was always second class.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I think you're exactly right. I think in that regard, I do feel that there's a much more natural alliance with African American or Africana kind of a diaspora communities, as well as the Latinx communities. And I think, basically, I mean, funny anecdote, almost 2 decades ago, maybe even more, I was talking with a group of Korean American pastoral friends in the Northeast, and I won't name the church, but you can probably guess which one it is. A very prominent evangelical church in Manhattan had just hired a Korean American pastor, right? And we were so excited. And these were mostly, I guess, I don't know what the right sociological term is, but many of them were either born in the States, so that'll be ABKs, right, American-born Koreans, or people like me, came here in elementary or middle school and things like that. And all of us were kind of, I guess, implicit. I mean, we weren't saying it outrightly, but we were all aware of the sort of a bamboo ceiling or whatever you call that, right? And yet this one broke through. And so there are like 4 or 5 of us talking about that and lauding the fact that this guy made it, right? Made it. And one guy said, yeah, and I think this is around 97, because I was headed to go to Cambridge for my graduate studies. And I served at Yongsan Presbyterian Church in Horsham, Pennsylvania. A shout out to my church that has meant so much in my formation. And my friend said, you must feel great that you're going to Cambridge for your PhD. I said, yeah. And then I said, what about this we're just talking about? If I came back and wanted to do a church, let's say I were to, because one guy said it very clearly, this guy is moving up in society, right? He made it in America. So I said, what if I were to come and serve as a church in a predominantly Black church? Have I made it in America, or am I going up or down in society, right? What I mean is this: I think when our parents have told us to succeed or do your best and make something of yourself, they were, I mean, understandably putting it in the typology of the dominant cultural and institutional and socioeconomic and power structure that is white. So they weren't like explicitly racist, but they were basically implicitly saying, go kick ass in the world. And one of the ways that you can crush it in the world is by making it in the majority's context that is white. That means that, and many of many of the parishioners at Yongsan were working in a sort of African-American neighborhoods as shopkeepers, shop owners. And so they, and you know, some were on the kind of outliers, but then many were not really giving back to the community. So further kind of exacerbating the sort of Black Korean kind of relationality. So I think as a result, many of us, unless you're in the academic world or pastoral world, you don't have the luxury of theorizing your racial identity. I mean, look, if you're working as an accountant or lawyer or doctor, you just got to go do your stuff every day, right? And you know, I mean, maybe you'll have some occasions to think about that when something happens to you directly. But then, so I feel more and more the responsibility, if someone would ask me to do it like you are, to really help kind of make sense of what it is that we do. I think it is that sort of a resonance that I found recently, and this is not a shameless plug, but you know, I spoke at a conference in Ottawa in November 2017, and that video, which is about, I think they just gave it a title of From Atheist to Christian at Yale, and I think it is watched, I don't know, by like 1.5, 1.6 million people now. Now, I did nothing to promote it. That organization that invited me did nothing to promote it, but maybe it's the word atheist, maybe it is turning from atheism to Christ. And in that video, I talk about being a loser when I was in high school, having no friends and going to church and experiencing the Korean American church youth group culture to be so exclusionary. And so many of these emails that I got, which is over 1,000 now, you know, it's been about 2.5 years. And many of them would say, you know, when you said that you were a loser in high school, I still resonated with you, right? So I think, you know, maybe this gives us an opportunity, or gives me an opportunity to talk about my own particularity as a racialized, ethnic, you know, Asian American, and how my life's journey toward God and human flourishing and loving my neighbor, what that looks like, especially in this context of COVID-19. I think, you know, again, I myself have not been prey to or victim of a lot of racialized epithets or, you know, violence, microaggressions. I mean, you know, maybe I'm just kind of too like in your face for that. I don't know, but so I'm on the one hand, I don't have a lot of personal stories of hurt, but at the same time, as the good Lord has given me an opportunity to assume some kind of a representative role, to speak to the larger culture, and to even within Asian American context, there are diversities of experiences and narratives, and we have to account for that because, you know, at the same time, there are a good number of Asian Americans for whom the last thing they want to do is engage with anything Asian American because it is too painful. It is because, and I was talking to some of my African American friends too. They're like, well, look, I don't want to think about African American stuff because I made it. I got out of that ghetto, right? I got out of that inner city, you know, context. And now don't ask me to go back and think about that because that's not me anymore. Maybe there's kind of a lot more resonance and commonalities and overlap between the African American and Asian American recent immigrant experience that I think must be kind of juxtaposed for the enhancement of both our cultures and both our kind of communities' greater flourishing in America and toward the city of God.
Yeah, no, I think even when you said, you know, that I was a loser, I grew up in so many different places that it dependent on what was valued in each context. I could fit within that, right? And so where Asians were more seen and acknowledged and had more of a stake in the community, like places in LA, I felt less of that. But in other places where it was more predominantly white, or there was a significant presence of a black and white, you know, skin color binary, I felt more of that. And it was very confusing because I went to 5 different high schools growing up. And so every different year I was in a different setting, and depending on how people perceived Asian American, it shaped the way that I was treated or I was received. And it was fascinating, even as I reflect back on it. And so I totally see that as well. And it's, you know, like you, and as you were saying at the end, like it is hard when a lot of the economic power is held by a predominantly white kind of constituency or group. And in order for you to gain access to that economic base or economic power, you have to play by a certain set of rules, which oftentimes means that you have to check kind of your own ethnic heritage at the door, and you can only bring in certain things that will benefit the rest of kind of like the dominant kind of mindset or the dominant framework. And so there's an internal personal negotiation. But I think one of the things that you also said was that's helpful is how, like you personally haven't experienced it, but because you're Korean American, you automatically affiliate and associate with other Korean Americans as you are, as you have within you a more collectivist orientation, right? You're not just an individual, you're also a part of a collective or community. And I think that's one of the things that really distinguishes Black, Latino, and Asian communities from white communities. Generally speaking, apart from like certain rural areas or certain kind of like much more family-oriented kind of communities within the white population, there's a difference between the hyper-individualism and then the kind of more collectivist-leaning orientations. And that shapes how we interact with each other, how we understand each other, and whether we believe in the stories that other people are actually sharing around their difficulties around race and ethnicity. And so I'm grateful for that. Now, you are also, you're also like one of the leading Reformation scholars, like 16th century. And as we're talking, about your Asian American identity and your Asian American experience, I'd be curious how your own scholarship has interfaced and interacted with your Asian Americanness. Like, what has your studies led you to understand about your Asian American realities, as well as Asian American realities more broadly, and then vice versa? How have you brought your Asian Americanness into your studies and your scholarship?
And that's a great question, especially in our days of identity political discourses as a sort of an emerging, if not leading, kind of modalities of doing humanistic disciplines or social sciences even. So I think, it was a lot of learning and unlearning, becoming and unbecoming that had to take place within my own journey. So as I indicated earlier, I went to Cambridge University in 1997. And there, I studied under a scholar whose name is Raymond Duffy, who's a leading Reformation historian of his generation. And as the name Raymond Duffy could tell you, is a very quintessential Irish Catholic name. And he was always in his living room. There was an old map of Ireland, and he married an English woman. And he would always, not always, but several times in my time of studying with him, he and I talked about the significance of that Irish map for him. And he told me something like, don't forget where you came from. Now, I doubt he would talk to his, non-racial minority students like that, or non-Irish student like that. I took it as a special kind of very important and poignant moments of education, or just speaking into my whole personhood. So I think on the one hand, he was like, hey, go read this Puritan named Richard Baxter and learn about his ecclesiology. And in that process of learning and reading, I don't think the ethnic particularity or my identity, identificational kind of a specificity mattered that much, at least not according to what he said. So there was a kind of an overlaying assumption of positivism. Like, so it is like whether a Black scholar read it or Asian scholar read it or white American scholar read this text, our conclusion will be relatively the same. And I bought that, relatively speaking, but then here are a couple of things that happened even in that journey. One is that I learned, based on hearsay, and I read it later, that one of the leading Reformation historians who's not around anymore, his name is Heiko Obermann, Heiko-Obermann. And he, as a Dutchman, having taught at Tübingen, Germany, or Harvard and University of Arizona in the US, maybe it's based upon his experience, or maybe just his conviction, ideological conviction. He said that the Reformation was a reformation of the refugees. Now, as a historical fact, it is absolutely true. As a historiographical trend, Was it talked about by a lot of people? No, not really. No. So in other words, you can go back and see that many of the leading reformers like Calvin's, Bucer and Peter Martyr Vermeulen, and there are all these kind of exiles in Emden, the Netherlands, or Frankfurt. It was actually the floor, and also the Reformation is a period of major migration, right? Political, religious kind of shifts meant that if you're living in a Catholic territory, you'd be better off by moving to a Protestant territory if you were a Protestant, and vice versa. So it was a period of massive migration, and many became, unplanned refugees. Calvin would be one of them. So I began to have a deeper affinity for Calvin, not because I'm a Frenchman or I'm a Genevan, and not necessarily even because I'm a Presbyterian, but because here's a refugee guy whose citizenship status wasn't granted until 5 years before he died. So he was basically a green card holder. And I thought that was real. And so for me, there was a kind of connection. But then I think at the same time, my own scholarship then tended to become more fixated on the issues of race and rights and Reformation. So I think that's one of the books that I plan to write after I finish this book on Christology. So I think basically I've had this kind of inner tussle, right? Because I wasn't really trained in like critical race theory and all that, but I was trained in an old school historiographical method of positivism. You go to the archive and read a manuscript, and you go to the library and read these ancient books and type notes, and then tell us what you found out. And so now, whether you're Korean or, or transgender, Cuban American or straight-laced Chinese American, did not really matter, according to my mentors. And I buy into it a little bit, but also I come to realize that one of the reasons why this whole idea of the Reformation as the Reformation of the refugees resonated so deeply and spoke so powerfully to me is because of my experience. So I think, and so I think it is important to have that kind of a allowance. I think it is basically those who kind of are scholars of the old method. They're not in the sort of leading universities as much anymore, unless you're in the UK, I suppose. There are still scholars at Oxford and Cambridge and London and St. Andrews and others at Edinburgh who think like that. And I think that's great. And that's why many evangelical scholars, especially in biblical studies and theological studies, have done their degrees in the UK. And I was part of that sort of mega trend of many evangelicals doing it. Although now, I think thanks to people like Mark Knoll, formerly of Wheaton, represent there, and, who have kind of done well in the sort of a majority kind of scholarly world. And so I think it has become a safer context. But for me, to go back to the first question, yeah, my ethnic identity has mattered a lot. But in what ways has it come out in my scholarship is something that I actually am wrestling with even right now. I mean, I think I'm writing a book on Jesus, Jesus Among the Idols. It's about Christological debates in the early Enlightenment period. I like to see something about how the debates about Jesus had some kind of a vector of race, like, were persons of African descent, were Africans deemed to be less than full-on like human beings as Europeans were. And I think there's some recent book done by David Whitfield at Baylor, done on Curse of Ham in early modern Europe. And I thought, like, maybe I could do something. So I think I am drawn toward it, not just because I want to be, not simply because I want to be trendy, but because these are things that kind of grab my interest. And I also think that David Whitford is a white American guy, and as white as apple pie in some ways, but maybe, and so I don't want to discount or invalidate someone's interest, like, some of the earlier generations of David Davis and others who wrote about American and slavery and race stuff. They're all old school white guys who taught at Harvard and Yale and Penn, and Columbia. So I don't want to stop someone from working on something just because it is not part of your ethnic enclave territory. But so I think, for me, I kind of almost went in the reverse direction. I want to be able to talk about, non-Asians and do it as well as other people who are the native, rights people, they're like English and I'm writing about English discourses. And so I think I've kind of done it for the last 20 years. And I am not saying that I've been there, done that. I think there's still, I could stay in this field and for the rest of my journey, earthly sojourn, scholarly journey, and then just begin to, scratch the surface. But I also feel that there is a sort of an ethical responsibility as an Asian American. But I was telling my wife recently, I used to think that I got to go and somehow, be in the leadership role and blah, blah, blah. And then I said to her, look, there's so many who are like, and I was interviewed by, I think, Christianity Today about this emergence of people like Joel Kim at Westminster Seminary or Walter Kim, the president of NAE, and then Julius Kim, all the Kims who are kind of crushing it, right? And, he's the Gospel Coalition CEO, whatever. And I told my wife, maybe I can just go back to doing what I'm doing, what I'm called to be, and have excelled, and that is as a scholar, right? Because, to be honest with you, I until more recently, I felt like I should be able to, I should aspire after these, deanships and blah, 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 because I feel like we were so underrepresented. But then now and even though I honestly don't think I'm really cut out to be, I'm really administratively gifted. When I actually look at myself, I feel like I am really much better suited as a scholar. I think I can geek out with the best of them, but to think about the budget, blah, 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 that's not my cup of tea. I tried and opportunities were presented to me before, but then I think in God's interesting providence, those things never really kind of actualized, meaning I left Vanderbilt to go there. It did not. And I think partly it's and it's just, so I am actually thankful to the kind of a renaissance or birth of Asian American leadership in the sort of a majority context. But as I said in that interview, what I said was, I hope that they don't just serve the interests of the white institution, because to do that, they didn't have to hire a Korean American person. So I think you have to think about two roles, pastoral and prophetic, right? Because priestly and prophetic, right? So, you are called upon. So is there something about, I suppose when you think about the threefold offices of Christ in the Reformed tradition, you would be kingly, priestly, and prophetic. So if you're a president or CEO, then you are sort of the kingly role, and you kind of administer and help shape the institution, so that's more priestly. But then in what ways will you be prophetic? And the prophetic is always going to be challenging and incredibly fraught. And I think, so while I don't wish them, to lose their job in the first 2 years because they've been prophetic persons, but at the same time, if we don't do anything like that, then what have we done? I think that's something that I've also struggled with. But if I can just be frank, today's my birthday. I turned 53 today, and it's a special day for me. And I've been thinking a lot about, what's really important. And I'm really much more interested in helping the younger generation, my sisters and brothers who are on similar pathway. And if I can be in some kind of encouragement, or exemplar, or at least exemplar in terms of don't do what don't, it's a negative example, don't be that guy kind of thing or whatever. I think that's great for me. And I think, it's platforms like this, or opportunities like this, that give me chances to be more self-critical and all the more grateful for the grace of God.
Well, first of all, happy birthday. Thank you.
Thank you
for sharing that. I feel bad. I should have had a whole parade or something set up for you.
No. Don't worry about it at all, please. Yeah.
Secondly, your last name is Lim. If you just missed it by one letter, so if you just were a K instead of an L, maybe things would have been different for you in terms of trajectory.
You never know, man. You never know. I know, right? Because people often assume that I'm Singaporean or Chinese, and I say, well, I'm sure my people were at one point, but not me in particular. But yeah, that thought did occur to me, because Julius Kim, who's a dear friend, reminds me, if you were actually Kim rather than Lim, more doors might have opened. I said, who knows, man? I don't know. So.
No, but I do think that what you said is such an important word, right? I mean, if we just only serve the interest of the majority group, then we basically perpetuate the same problems. And yet, at the same time, it's oftentimes the burden is placed on people of color who assume these leadership roles, and so they
I
do have
know.
a double burden. But and so there's this extra negotiation that takes place in terms of how prophetic are you, how much of the threefold ministry are you actually living into, or are you only living into like a truncated version of the threefold ministry where the parts of you that are welcome can kind of operate, but that's only like 2/3 or even a third. I remember having a conversation with someone that said, I asked them, I was like, like of the threefold, like, do you want all three for this particular role, as they were asking me about like potentially looking into a position. And they said, well, we probably don't want your kingly role, and we probably don't want your prophetic role. All we want is your priestly role. And at that point, I was like, yeah, this is probably not the job for me then, because I don't think that I want to be a third of what Jesus calls me to be. I want to be all of what Jesus calls me to be. And if there are things that need a prophetic voice, that we should bring in a prophetic voice. And the areas that need a priestly voice, we need to bring in our priestly voice. And in areas that we need a kingly voice and skills, we need to bring all of those things in. And, that's kind of the way that God has created us and wired us. And, and it's usually, upon people of color that often experience this, right? It's like everyone else can bring in their whole selves, but people of color can only bring a part of themselves.
I think that's a very good point.
Yeah, but then there's two more questions that I want to ask, and one of them was driven by a brief comment that you made. You said that you took a more positivist kind of approach to all your scholarship because that's what you were taught. But then if you had taken a CRT or critical race theory approach, you might have had different scholarship today. One, there's a big divide by a small faction of people within, I guess the more hyper-conservative spaces that really pushes against CRT, right? And, as Christians, we don't take anything wholesale, but we do try to uncover truth wherever it may be found, whether we agree with the source or not, right? I mean, God spoke through a donkey. And so if we can get truth through a donkey, we could probably get truth through other scholarship as well. Obviously, CRT, in my opinion, doesn't give us an eschatological vision, but it does do a good job of identifying some of the problems. But people have a really hard time of articulating that. And because they feel like, and because a lot of people don't even understand the field anyway, there's a lot of suspicion and skepticism, so that even the good can't be extracted. I'd be curious what your thoughts on that is, what your thoughts are around critical race theory. Is it helpful? Is it harmful? Why is there such confusion and division around the issue? And how can we, move forward? Is it worth exploring? Is it not worth exploring? What can we extract from it? Should we discard it all? Just the whole gamut.
No, that's a great penetrating question. So I love the way you put it, that Christians don't take any truth claims wholesale or something like that. And you realize our own epistemological slippage right there. You said those words less than 2 minutes ago and I'm not able to replicate it exactly, but I think I got the gist of it, right? So and yet there are certain there are certain enclaves of knowing where, let's say, for some, it's the CRT or bust, right? Or others will be RT or bust, right? Reformed theology, right? So Reformed theology minus C, or bust, right? So then I think that's where, love the way you put it, it's the gospel, all truth is God's truth, or wherever it's found. Whether it is, I guess Schaefer said it, or at this point in my career, I don't care who said it, but I think, that sounds right to me. And I love the way you put it about the absence of eschatology, giving you the kind of wherewithal to say, yeah, it's really helpful, but not all the way. Like I said earlier, this book by Professor Sean Copeland, Knowing Christ Crucified, The Witness of African-American Religious Experience, was a sort of a bomb thrown into my kind of not bomb, it was like a wake-up call for me, and incredibly formative. And it was really helpful for me to realize that, you know what, an old dog can learn a new trick. I'm 50. When I picked up this book, I was 52. I said, yeah, there's a lot that I can learn and should learn. Again, I think, being open to God's surprising work of the surprising work of the Spirit. You're right. God can speak through asses and, rocks and, and babies will cry out. And so if that is the case, and since that is the case, then I should be really open to learning from Reformed theology, as well as, my Buddhist friends who are thinking about meditation and suffering, as well as friends who are, knee deep and devoting their lives to critical race theory. I think that kind of posture would not be possible if I wasn't at Vanderbilt University and the Divinity School, actually. I think if I was at another institution, I think I would have the sort of a general, because of my kind of minoritized experience, I'll be more open to and willing to learn from and engage with people from different perspectives. Because I think, I've had it, just an anecdote. When I was in England doing my graduate studies, I got to preach at this church, a very well-known church in Cambridge. And I remember after the sermon, one of the old ladies walked up to me and she said, no joke, she said, I really appreciated your sermon today because you're the first non-English, non-white person to speak from the pulpit. And then she said, and that, so far so good. Then she said, I don't know what this world is coming to, right? And I was like, so when she said that, I was, first non-white person to speak from the pulpit, that was great. But then I didn't really ask her what she meant by, I don't know what this world is coming to. Was she disgusted by it? Was she afraid of it? Or was she excited by the new prospect of this whole kind of the next Christendom, I quite think the former, but it didn't matter to me. So I think it is. So I feel like in some ways I sort of embody the other when I occupy and get invited to address these, matters of, look, I think the issues of God, salvation, and self are really important, right? So I think maybe the majority culture is giving more space. Yeah, I don't mind if, a Korean immigrant fixes my car or fixes my shoes, or that guy does my dry cleaning. Or maybe I'll give him my lawyering job. Maybe I can ask him to take care of my taxes or my investments. But my soul's destiny, that's something that I'm only going to entrust people who look like me or talk like me. And so I think there's a kind of opening of the vista. And I do think that, the whole eschatological absence or something of that sort that you mentioned is really helpful. I do also think that, one of the scholars that I learned a lot from, she passed away a couple of years ago. Her name is Saba Mahmood, Saba Mahmoud, Mood, I think. She was an anthropologist at UC Berkeley. And she wrote books, the title escapes me right now, but it's about politics of, so I will tell you in just 1 second, politics of piety, and it's about the Islamic revival and this feminist subject. And so again, she's Pakistani American, an anthropologist who wrote about Egyptian 1990s piety movement within Egyptian Islam, and yet the issues that she brought up really resonated with me. So for me, and that book was a result of teaching this first year pro seminar for PhD students, all PhD students in religious studies at Vanderbilt, called The Study of Religion. And so I got to interact with a lot of different types of material. Some are really critical race theory, others are not. I think, so because I was trained at a more positivistic institution, I never had to read any Foucault, right? So, and my friends would be like aghast, like they were like incredulous, like, you never read any Foucault? I said, no. I wasn't ashamed by it, nor was I necessarily proud of it, but that was me, right? And then I began teaching Foucault, just staying one lecture ahead of my students, and I realized there's a lot to be learned from here. And if I really believe that all truth is God's truth, and I think there is a kind of epistemic humility to learn from others, then I think there is a lot to be said. I think the critical race theory is is rocks crying out, like because of the whole history of exclusion of certain groups of people as subpar or second class or third class or barely human. I think, there is a kind of a desire for recognition, reparation that is, and I do think that these are important things for us to think about. I think that the trouble for Asian Americans is that, not trouble, but the complicating factor, as you noted well, is that we are having to manage and negotiate these different, and yet we don't really have a particularly demarcated space. So when they talk about critical race theory, what is the contribution of persons of, Asian and Asian American descent? What is their role? I mean, I think it is important to wrestle with it. It is important to struggle there. But for me, I think critical race theory has helped to think about my own self as a person created in the image of God, and also providentially placed in my life journey here and now at this time in this country, at this particular matrix of who I am, and knowing that and believing deep in my heart that I'm not a mistake. I think I know what that is like. I think there were sustained periods in my life where I did resent the fact that I came to America when I did, I am this, and and if someone were to ask me, would you change anything about your identity matrix if you could change it? Would you do it? I think that's a real hard question, right? And I'm not assuming that majority culture people say I just want to stay the way I am. I think maybe it's different. So then I think that's where I think a robust theology of providence is helpful, right? That if I am of the theological conviction that God does not make mistakes, and that God did not make a mistake in my identity presentation in the way I am, then the secondary question and more important question becomes, how will I then seek the peace of the city and and journey toward the city of God, as God's Spirit, God's Spirit aids my journey toward Him. I've been a little bit all over, but hopefully you get the gist.
No, that was good. That was super helpful. I mean, this actually, the question I've been most excited to get into actually perfectly follows this. Like you earlier shared that since you moved to the United States, you've never been able to avoid thinking about your race, right? You never thought about it before, but then as soon as you got to the US, every single day you said you were thinking about your race. And that's a pretty stark statement, because like I think when I think about like Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, In Between the World and Me, he writes this letter to his son, that, talking about what it's like to be a Black person in America. And there's a quote that just kind of jumped out at me, that race is the child of racism, right? That we only experience race because racism exists. Now you're a PCA guy, you're some sort of like scholar in residence, a preacher in residence at a PCA church. You've been in it sounds like you identify as an evangelical in terms of like the upbringing and the experiences that you have. I mean, most Korean Americans have either grown up in a PCA or a Methodist church, really, it seems like. But then I would be curious, what resources from historical Christianity, either Reformation or post-Reformation, can we draw on to combat issues of racism, right? Because if what you're saying is true, that you haven't gone through a day in the United States without addressing the issue of race, and if Ta-Nehisi Coates' statement that race is a child of racism, then we have to disentangle ourselves, especially within the church, from the construct of race and all of the effects that race and racialization has had on us. So I'd be curious, like, if you can help us, like, help some of our listeners to think about the roots within Reformation and post-Reformation kind of realities that we can draw from to address issues of racism.
Yeah, no, that's a sobering question, in that I think, well, put it this way, when is the last time you talked about and investigated matters to do with Mozambique? Right, probably never. It's not part of your life. It's not part of your, everyday discourse. I think for many, for better and for worse, in the Reformation world, the issue of race, I think there's a very important book, who just happens to be an Asian American. It's a book called The Invention of Race in European Middle Ages by Geraldine Heng. She's at UT Austin, University of Texas at Austin. She makes a pretty, and this is the winner of the 2019 American Academy of Religions uh, Scholarly Book of Excellence in Historical Studies. Heng makes this argument that the construction of race was not a Kantian kind of a contribution. It had existed many, many centuries prior. It was an embedded part of European discourse about the other, starting with the Jews and Muslims. And right, it was kind of a, right, so, because I think to think about racialization, it is not possible to exclude the Jews and the Muslims and the Saracens and the Africans. And what she's arguing is that, you know, this is kind of an emerging part of the discourse of the empire. You know, embarrassing text called "The Jews and Their Lies," after having written a book called that Jesus Christ was born a Jew. So it's 1523, seemingly and possibly Philo-Semitic text. 1543, definitely anti-Semitic text. Calvin and Servetus. So I think, you know, and I've been struggling with this a lot. I think, were there bright spots in Europe's long Reformation history? You got like Bartolome de las Casas, who was a sort of a defender of the human rights of the Native Americans, you know, in the Dominican Republic and Cuba. But at the same time, he said, well, you know, because these Native Americans are not well suited for harsh labor, let's bring in slaves from Africa to do the work. So I think one of the things that convinces me as an Augustinian Calvinist is that all of us have clay feet, meaning none of us can say, I am perfectly impeccable, nor can one say that I'm perfectly kind of irredeemable, right? So it is that there's no one who's so great, nor is there one so grotesque that is beyond the need for redemption or beyond the hope of redemption. So I think when I saw the Quakers, right, I mean, they were actually one of the earliest abolitionists. So I think you got some of the bright spots, but when you think about Lutherans and Presbyterians and Baptists were a little bit more involved. And I think, so why did it take that long, right? And well, you can ask the question of today, you know, whoever that author that you mentioned about race and racism, is that person consistently and completely woke, that he's extending that grace, that, you know, grace and justice kind of in the way that, you know, again, I don't want to put someone on a pedestal and says, look at that person because that person made it. I mean, I don't think MLK did. I don't think Malcolm X did. I don't think Yoon Chi-ho did. I don't think any of these people, Mother Teresa did. So, but at the same time, I do think that what has been helpful is that these heroes and heroines of faith that I've admired from a long time ago are also people of flesh and blood and feet of clay. I do think that as a sort of a collective whole of an important part of, at least a part of human civilizations in the early modern period, I think the role of Christianity was kind of working with empire and ecclesia. So, you know, I often say this, right? I often tell students, look, in the Reformation and post-Reformation world, there are three groups of people that went together to the unknown, either to unknown parts of the world: merchants, mercenaries, and missionaries, right? And then they often work together almost seamlessly at tandem, sometimes at cross purposes. And I think we have to ask the question of the contribution of Christian missions or Christian proclamation of the gospel in these contexts, in the colonial and post-colonial and neo-colonial context, with critical lenses, right? Because just because there is a lapse of charity among all Christians at this time period doesn't mean that Christianity is untrue, although it does become a much more pressing issue to demonstrate. If all the followers of Christ were so, you know, schmuckish, then how do you demonstrate its salutarity? right? I think these are important questions.
No,
So
I'm so grateful for the time that we were able to spend. That was extremely rich, and I think that there's so much more we could have uncovered, and we hit a lot. But I am grateful for the time that you spent on your birthday. Happy birthday! Thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to continuing the discussions in the future.